My 12-year-old daughter Sophia was checking her blood sugar in our backyard when her levels dropped dangerously low. As she reached for glucose tablets to save her life, HOA President Beverly Morrison grabbed a metal fork and stabbed Sophia in the leg. She had no idea Sophia's dad was the deputy commissioner. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. My name is Michael Torres and I've spent my entire career in law enforcement working to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. As Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Department, I've seen the worst that humanity has to offer, but I never imagined that evil would target my own family in such a shocking way. My daughter Sophia is 12 years old and has been living with type 1 diabetes since she was 6. She's a brave, intelligent girl who manages her condition with remarkable maturity for her age. Sophia checks her blood sugar multiple times a day, gives herself insulin injections, and carefully monitors what she eats to keep her diabetes under control. Despite the challenges of her medical condition, Sophia is a happy, active child who loves reading, drawing, and spending time with her friends. She's an honor student at her school and has never let diabetes stop her from pursuing her dreams. My wife Maria and I decided to move to Rosewood Hills, an upscale suburban community, because we wanted Sophia to grow up in a safe neighborhood with good schools and plenty of opportunities. The community had excellent ratings for education and public safety, and the houses were beautiful with large yards where Sophia could play safely. "Dad, I love our new house," Sophia told me excitedly as we finished unpacking. "Can I explore the neighborhood and meet some of the other kids?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, smiling at her enthusiasm. "Just remember to take your blood glucose monitor with you, and come home if you start feeling low." Sophia nodded and grabbed her small medical kit that she always carried with her. The kit contained her glucose meter, test strips, glucose tablets for emergencies, and her insulin pen. She had been managing her diabetes independently for years, and Maria and I were proud of how responsible she had become. As Sophia headed out to explore our new neighborhood, I felt hopeful about this fresh start for our family. After years of living in the city where I dealt with crime and violence every day, the quiet suburban community seemed like the perfect place to raise our daughter. But I had no idea that we were about to encounter a different kind of predator, one who hid behind the mask of respectability and community authority. Our first encounter with trouble came just 2 days after we moved in. Sophia was in our front yard, carefully testing her blood sugar before having an afternoon snack, when a tall, stern-looking woman approached our property. The woman was in her early 60s with perfectly styled gray hair and expensive clothing that screamed wealth and status. She walked with the confidence of someone who was used to being in charge and having people defer to her authority. "Excuse me," the woman said sharply, startling Sophia. "What are you doing?" Sophia looked up from her glucose meter, confused by the woman's aggressive tone. "I'm just checking my blood sugar. I have diabetes, so I need to test it before I eat." The woman's expression became even more disapproving as she stared at Sophia's medical supplies. "I'm Beverly Morrison, president of the Rosewood Hills Homeowners Association. Are you aware that medical procedures are not permitted in public areas of the community?" Sophia blinked in confusion. "Medical procedures? I'm just checking my blood sugar. I do this everywhere, at school, at home, at the mall. It's just part of having diabetes." "Well, it's not part of living in Rosewood Hills," Mrs. Morrison said coldly. "Our community standards prohibit activities that could be disturbing or unsightly to other residents. Blood testing falls into that category." I had been watching this exchange from the kitchen window, and I quickly went outside to intervene. As a law enforcement officer, I had dealt with plenty of difficult people, but seeing someone harass my daughter about her medical condition made my blood boil. "Is there a problem here?" I asked, stepping protectively beside Sophia. Mrs. Morrison turned her cold stare on me. "You must be the father." "I'm Beverly Morrison, HOA president. I was just explaining to your daughter that medical activities are not appropriate for public areas." "Medical activities?" I repeated, not believing what I was hearing. "She's testing her blood sugar. She's diabetic. This is a basic medical necessity, not an optional activity." "Nevertheless, it violates community standards," Mrs. Morrison said firmly. "If your daughter needs to perform medical procedures, she should do so inside your house where other residents won't be disturbed by the sight." "Ma'am, my daughter has type 1 diabetes," I explained, working to keep my voice calm and professional. "She needs to test her blood sugar multiple times a day, wherever she happens to be. This is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Mrs. Morrison's expression didn't soften at all. "The ADA doesn't override HOA community standards. If your family can't comply with our rules, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you. Sophia was listening to this conversation with growing distress. She had never been made to feel ashamed of her diabetes before, and Mrs. Morrison's attitude was clearly upsetting her. "Dad, am I doing something wrong?" Sophia asked quietly. "No, sweetheart, you're not doing anything wrong," I said firmly, keeping my eyes on Mrs. Morrison. "Managing your diabetes is exactly what you should be doing, and you can do it anywhere you need to." Mrs. Morrison pulled out a small notebook and began writing. "I'm issuing your family a formal violation notice for non-compliance with community health and safety standards. You have 48 hours to acknowledge receipt and develop a compliance plan." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Sophia and me standing in our front yard, shocked by what had just happened. "Dad, I don't understand," Sophia said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Why doesn't she want me to check my blood sugar?" "Because she's an ignorant person who doesn't understand diabetes," I said, hugging my daughter. "Don't worry about her, Sophia. You keep doing exactly what you need to do to stay healthy." But even as I reassured Sophia, I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of our problems with Beverly Morrison. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Morrison's harassment of our family escalated dramatically. She seemed to have made it her personal mission to find fault with everything Sophia did related to her diabetes management. Mrs. Morrison filed formal complaints claiming that Sophia's glucose testing created biohazardous waste in public areas. She demanded that we provide documentation proving that Sophia's medical supplies were properly sterilized before bringing them into the community. She even suggested that Sophia's insulin injections posed a drug use problem that needed to be reported to local authorities. Each complaint was more ridiculous than the last, but Mrs. Morrison presented them with such official authority that some of our neighbors began to look at Sophia with suspicion and concern. "Mrs. Torres, I got a call from the HOA president about your daughter," said our next-door neighbor, Janet Williams. "She said there might be some kind of drug problem. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Maria had to explain to Janet and several other neighbors that Sophia was diabetic and that her insulin was life-saving medication, not illegal drugs. The fact that we had to defend our 12-year-old daughter's medical treatment to our neighbors was both humiliating and infuriating. But Mrs. Morrison's harassment wasn't limited to complaints and rumors. She also began following Sophia around the neighborhood, taking pictures of her whenever she checked her blood sugar or administered insulin. "Dad, that lady is following me again," Sophia told me one evening after coming home from a friend's house. "She was hiding behind a tree taking pictures while I was checking my blood sugar at the park." The idea that a grown woman was stalking my daughter and photographing her medical care filled me with rage. As deputy commissioner, I had the authority to investigate harassment and stalking cases, but I also knew that I needed to be careful about using my official position in a personal matter. I decided to try one more time to reason with Mrs. Morrison before taking more serious action. I went to Mrs. Morrison's house on a Saturday morning, planning to have a calm, rational conversation about her behavior towards Sophia. Mrs. Morrison lived in the largest house in the community, a sprawling mansion that reflected her status as the wealthiest and most powerful resident. When Mrs. Morrison answered the door, her expression immediately became hostile. "Deputy Commissioner Torres," she said, emphasizing my title in a mocking tone. "What brings you to my home?" "Mrs. Morrison, I think we need to discuss your harassment of my daughter," I said directly. "Your behavior is becoming unacceptable and it needs to stop." "Harassment?" Mrs. Morrison laughed coldly. "I'm simply enforcing community standards that every resident agreed to follow. If your daughter can't comply with basic rules, that's not my problem." "My daughter is managing a serious medical condition," I said firmly. "She has every right to test her blood sugar and take her insulin whenever and wherever she needs to. That's not negotiable." "Everything is negotiable in my community," Mrs. Morrison replied. "I've been HOA president for 15 years, and I've successfully maintained property values and community standards throughout that time. I won't let one problem family destroy what we've built." "Problem family?" I repeated, feeling my anger rising. "Mrs. Morrison, my daughter has diabetes. She's not a problem. She's a child with a medical condition that requires daily management." "Your daughter is disruptive, unsightly, and potentially dangerous," Mrs. Morrison said bluntly. "Her medical activities make other residents uncomfortable, and her condition could pose health risks to other children." I stared at her in disbelief. "Are you suggesting that diabetes is contagious?" "I'm suggesting that children with serious medical conditions don't belong in communities like ours," Mrs. Morrison said. "We have standards here, and those standards don't accommodate every special need or medical problem. That's when I realized that Mrs. Morrison wasn't just ignorant about diabetes. She was actively discriminating against Sophia because of her disability. Mrs. Morrison, what you're describing is illegal discrimination under federal law, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I used in official police business. I strongly advise you to educate yourself about disability rights before you do something that lands you in serious legal trouble. Mrs. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me, Deputy Commissioner? I'm warning you, I replied. Leave my daughter alone. Stop harassing her about her medical care. And stop spreading rumors about our family. If you continue this behavior, I will pursue every legal remedy available to protect my child. Mrs. Morrison smiled coldly. We'll see about that. As I walked away from her house, I had the distinct feeling that Mrs. Morrison viewed my warning as a challenge rather than a deterrent. I should have realized that someone with her level of arrogance and power wouldn't be intimidated by legal threats. I should have known she would escalate to violence. The attack happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Sophia had just gotten home from school and was in our backyard doing her homework at the picnic table. It was a beautiful fall day, and she wanted to enjoy the sunshine while working on her math assignments. Around 3:30 p.m., Sophia began feeling the familiar symptoms of low blood sugar. Dizziness, shakiness, and difficulty concentrating. She immediately stopped her homework and pulled out her glucose meter to check her levels. The reading was 65 milligrams per deciliter, which was below the normal range and required immediate treatment. Sophia opened her medical kit and took out a glucose tablet, which would help raise her blood sugar quickly. That's when Mrs. Morrison appeared. What did I tell you about medical activities in public areas? Mrs. Morrison said sharply, approaching Sophia from behind. Sophia turned around, startled by the aggressive tone. Mrs. Morrison, my blood sugar is low. I need to treat it right away or I could pass out. I don't care about your excuses, Mrs. Morrison said, her voice filled with venom. You're violating community standards and I won't tolerate it anymore. Sophia tried to explain. Please, I just need to eat this glucose tablet and check my blood sugar again in 15 minutes. Low blood sugar can be really dangerous if I don't treat it. But Mrs. Morrison wasn't listening. She was staring at Sophia's medical supplies with disgust and rage, as if their very existence was a personal affront to her authority. You think you can just ignore my rules because your father is a police officer, Mrs. Morrison said, stepping closer to Sophia. Well, I have news for you, your father can't protect you from consequences. Sophia was becoming increasingly frightened by Mrs. Morrison's aggressive behavior, but she was also starting to feel worse as her blood sugar continued to drop. Please, I really need to take my medicine, Sophia said weakly. I'm starting to feel sick. That's when Mrs. Morrison snapped. I'll show you sick, she screamed, and she grabbed a metal fork from the picnic table where Sophia had been eating lunch earlier. Before Sophia could react or escape, Mrs. Morrison raised the fork above her head and brought it down with all her strength, stabbing Sophia directly in the left leg. The metal prongs of the fork penetrated deep into Sophia's thigh, and blood immediately began flowing from the wound. Sophia screamed in pain and terror as Mrs. Morrison stood over her, breathing heavily and still holding the bloody fork. Maybe now you'll learn to follow the rules, Mrs. Morrison said coldly, looking down at Sophia who was crying and trying to stop the bleeding from her leg. Sophia's blood sugar was still dangerously low, and now she was also dealing with a serious puncture wound that was bleeding heavily. She was in shock, in pain, and in immediate medical danger from two different sources. Help! Sophia screamed as loud as she could. Help me! Mrs. Morrison looked around nervously, as if suddenly realizing what she had done. Then she dropped the fork and quickly walked away, leaving my 12-year-old diabetic daughter bleeding and in diabetic distress in our backyard. I was in my office at police headquarters when my phone rang. It was Maria calling from home, and I could immediately tell from her voice that something was terribly wrong. Michael, you need to come home right now, Maria said, her voice shaking with panic. Sophia's been hurt. Someone stabbed her with a fork. What? I shouted, already grabbing my keys and heading for the door. Oh, where is she now? She's in the backyard. I found her bleeding and her blood sugar was dangerously low. I've called 911, but you need to get here. I made the 20-minute drive home in 12 minutes, using my emergency lights and siren to clear traffic. When I arrived, I found paramedics treating Sophia while Maria held her hand and tried to comfort her. Sophia was conscious but weak. The fork wound in her leg was bandaged, and the paramedics had given her glucose to treat her low blood sugar. Daddy? Sophia cried when she saw me. Mrs. Morrison stabbed me. She said I was breaking the rules by checking my blood sugar. I knelt beside my daughter, my heart breaking at the sight of her pain and fear. Who did this to you, sweetheart? Mrs. Morrison from the HOA, Sophia said through her tears. I was having low blood sugar and I needed to take a glucose tablet, but she got really angry and grabbed the fork from the table. She stabbed me in the leg and said maybe now I'd learn to follow the rules. The paramedic looked up at me with a grim expression. The wound is deep and will need stitches, but she's going to be okay. The bigger concern was her blood sugar. It was down to 58 when we got here. If this had gone on much longer without treatment, she could have lost consciousness. As they loaded Sophia into the ambulance, I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 20-year law enforcement career. Someone had attacked my child, someone who was supposed to be a community leader, someone who had stabbed a diabetic girl for the crime of trying to manage her medical condition. Mrs. Morrison had picked the wrong family to terrorize. While Sophia was being treated at the hospital, I immediately called my deputy and requested a full investigation team to respond to my house. As deputy commissioner, I knew I couldn't personally investigate the attack on my daughter, but I could ensure that it received the highest priority and the most experienced detectives. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived within 30 minutes and began processing the crime scene. The fork that Mrs. Morrison had used to stab Sophia was still lying in the backyard where she had dropped it, covered in Sophia's blood. We'll test this for fingerprints, but based on your daughter's statement, we have a clear case of aggravated assault on a minor, Detective Martinez told me. Do you want to tell me about any prior conflicts with the suspect? I provided Detective Martinez with a detailed account of Mrs. Morrison's harassment campaign against Sophia, including the HOA complaints, the stalking behavior, and the discriminatory comments about Sophia's diabetes. This wasn't a random attack, Detective Martinez concluded. This was the culmination of a systematic harassment campaign motivated by disability discrimination. We're looking at hate crime charges in addition to the assault. The evidence was overwhelming. The fork had Mrs. Morrison's fingerprints on it. 3 neighbors had heard Sophia screaming and had seen Mrs. Morrison leaving our backyard immediately after the attack. And the months of documented harassment showed clear evidence of premeditation. Detective Martinez went to arrest Mrs. Morrison that evening, accompanied by 4 other officers in case she resisted. According to the arrest report, Mrs. Morrison was shocked when the police showed up at her door with handcuffs and a warrant. "This is ridiculous," she told the officers. "I was simply disciplining a child who was violating community standards. Parents should thank me for teaching their children proper behavior." "Ma'am, you stabbed a 12-year-old girl with a fork," Detective Martinez replied. "That's aggravated assault on a minor, not community discipline." "She was performing unsanitary medical procedures in public," Mrs. Morrison insisted. "I had every right to enforce our community health standards." Even as she was being arrested for stabbing my daughter, Mrs. Morrison continued to justify her actions and show no remorse for what she had done. Sophia spent 2 days in the hospital recovering from her injuries. The fork wound required 12 stitches and had to be carefully monitored for signs of infection, which was especially dangerous for a diabetic patient. "Children with diabetes have compromised healing abilities," explained Dr. Jennifer Park, Sophia's pediatric endocrinologist. "Even a wound like this can become seriously infected if we're not careful. We'll need to watch her blood sugar closely and keep the wound clean and monitored." Sophia was also dealing with the psychological trauma of the attack. She had nightmares about Mrs. Morrison coming after her with other weapons, and she was afraid to go outside or check her blood sugar where anyone could see her. "She's developed anxiety around her diabetes management," explained Dr. Amanda Foster, the child psychologist who was helping Sophia process the trauma. "The attack has made her feel ashamed and afraid of the very activities that keep her healthy and alive." This was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Mrs. Morrison's attack. Sophia had always been proud of how well she managed her diabetes, but now she associated her medical care with danger and violence. "I don't want to check my blood sugar anymore," Sophia told me tearfully. "What if someone else gets angry at me? What if they hurt me again?" "Sweetheart, what Mrs. Morrison did was wrong," I said, holding her close. "Most people understand that you need to take care of your diabetes. She was a bad person who did a terrible thing, but that doesn't mean you should stop taking care of yourself." The hospital also provided security guards outside Sophia's room after Mrs. Morrison's attorney made statements to the press suggesting that Sophia had provoked the attack by flaunting her medical condition. District Attorney Lisa Rodriguez personally took over Mrs. Morrison's prosecution, recognizing the serious nature of the case and its implications for disability rights. This case represents a shocking example of disability-based violence, DA Rodriguez announced during a press conference. Mrs. Morrison attacked a child for the simple act of managing her diabetes. This kind of hatred and discrimination will not be tolerated in our community. Mrs. Morrison was charged with aggravated assault on a minor, assault with a deadly weapon, the disability-based hate crime, child abuse, criminal harassment, the violation of federal civil rights. The hate crime charges were particularly significant because they carried enhanced penalties and federal oversight. Mrs. Morrison specifically targeted Sophia because of her diabetes, explained federal prosecutor David Kim. She repeatedly harassed the family about Sophia's medical condition, and she attacked Sophia while she was trying to treat dangerously low blood sugar. This clearly meets the definition of a disability-based hate crime. Mrs. Morrison's legal team tried to argue that she had been protecting community health and safety, but the evidence of her discriminatory harassment made such arguments impossible to sustain. No reasonable person attacks a diabetic child for testing her blood sugar, DA Rodriguez said. This was disability discrimination that escalated to violence, plain and simple. Mrs. Morrison was denied bail after the judge determined that she posed a continued threat to Sophia and other disabled community members. News of Mrs. Morrison's attack on Sophia spread quickly through Rosewood Hills and then to the broader metropolitan area. The reaction from our neighbors was swift and decisive. Many residents came forward to share their own stories of harassment and intimidation by Mrs. Morrison, revealing a pattern of abusive behavior that had been going on for years. She made our lives miserable when our son was going through cancer treatments, said neighbor Patricia Williams. She complained that his medical equipment was an eyesore and tried to fine us for having a handicap parking sign in our driveway. Mrs. Morrison called Child Protective Services on us when our daughter had an asthma attack at the community pool, added James Chin. She claimed we were neglecting our child by not preventing the attack. The HOA board immediately removed Mrs. Morrison from her position and issued a formal apology to our family and all residents who had been harassed by her over the years. We deeply regret that Mrs. Morrison's actions were allowed to continue for so long, said new board president Robert Johnson. We are implementing new policies to ensure that no resident is ever again subjected to discrimination or harassment based on disability or medical conditions. The community also rallied around Sophia, organizing fundraisers for her medical expenses and sending her hundreds of cards and letters of support. Sophia is a brave, wonderful girl who deserves to live without fear, wrote one neighbor. Mrs. Morrison's attack on her was an attack on all of us who believe in treating children with kindness and respect. Mrs. Morrison's trial began 6 months after the attack and quickly became a media sensation. The case attracted national attention as an example of the discrimination and violence that disabled individuals face every day. The prosecution presented a methodical case that demonstrated Mrs. Morrison's escalating harassment of Sophia and her premeditated plan to discipline her with violence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, DA Rodriguez said in her opening statement, Beverly Morrison didn't just wake up one day and decide to stab a child with a fork. She spent months harassing Sophia Torres because she couldn't stand the sight of a diabetic child managing her medical condition in public. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution played recordings of Mrs. Morrison's complaints to the HOA, showed photographs of her stalking Sophia, and presented testimony from multiple witnesses who had seen the escalating harassment. Sophia testified about the attack, describing how she had been trying to treat dangerously low blood sugar when Mrs. Morrison stabbed her. I was feeling really sick because my blood sugar was low, Sophia said bravely from the witness stand. I told her I needed to take my medicine, but she got really angry and grabbed the fork. She stabbed me and said maybe now I would learn to follow the rules. I testified about Mrs. Morrison's pattern of harassment and discrimination, describing how she had specifically targeted Sophia because of her diabetes. Mrs. Morrison made it clear that she believed diabetic children didn't belong in her community, I told the jury. She harassed my daughter for months before finally escalating to violence. The defense tried to argue that Mrs. Morrison had been suffering from mental illness, but the evidence of her calculated harassment campaign made it clear that her actions had been deliberate and planned. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Mrs. Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Sophia's physical recovery from the fork attack was relatively quick, but the psychological trauma took much longer to heal. She worked with Dr. Foster for over a year to overcome her fear and anxiety around diabetes management. Sophia had to relearn that taking care of her diabetes was not something to be ashamed of, Dr. Foster explained. Mrs. Morrison's attack had made her feel like her medical condition was somehow wrong or offensive. Gradually, Sophia regained her confidence and resumed normal management of her diabetes. She also became an advocate for other children with medical conditions, speaking at schools and community events about disability awareness. Having diabetes is just part of who I am, Sophia would tell audiences. It doesn't make me different or wrong, it just means I have to take medicine and check my blood sugar. That's not scary or gross, it's just what I do to stay healthy. Sophia's courage and resilience inspired everyone who met her, but perhaps no one was more proud than Maria and me. That woman tried to break our daughter's spirit, Maria said. Instead, she made Sophia stronger and more determined to help other children who face discrimination. The attack had also brought our family closer together and reminded us of what was truly important in life. In addition to the criminal case, we filed a civil lawsuit against Mrs. Morrison and the Rosewood Hills HOA for damages related to Sophia's attack and the months of harassment that preceded it. The civil trial revealed even more disturbing details about Mrs. Morrison's mental state and her obsession with controlling the community. Mrs. Morrison viewed Sophia's diabetes as a personal affront to her vision of community perfection, testified Dr. Rachel Martinez, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Mrs. Morrison. She dehumanized Sophia to the point where she felt justified in using violence to eliminate what she saw as a problem. The HOA was found partially liable for Mrs. Morrison's actions because they had failed to provide adequate oversight of her behavior and had allowed her to operate with unchecked authority for over a decade. The board knew that Mrs. Morrison was harassing residents, but they failed to take action to stop her, our attorney argued. This negligence created the conditions that allowed her harassment to escalate into violence. The jury awarded our family $2.8 million in damages, which would help cover Sophia's ongoing medical expenses and provide some financial security for her future. Mrs. Morrison's assets, including her mansion and investments, were seized to pay the judgment. The woman who had once been the wealthiest and most powerful person in Rosewood Hills was left with nothing but a prison cell. As Sophia grew older, she became increasingly involved in disability rights advocacy. At age 15, she testified before Congress about the discrimination and violence that disabled individuals face in their communities. When I was 12 years old, a woman stabbed me with a fork because I was checking my blood sugar, Sophia told the Congressional Committee. She thought that my diabetes made me unfit to live in her neighborhood. But having diabetes doesn't make me less valuable or less deserving of respect. Sophia's testimony helped lead to the passage of stronger hate crime legislation that specifically protected disabled individuals from violence and harassment. She also started a nonprofit organization called Sophia's Voice, that provided support and advocacy for children with medical conditions who face discrimination or bullying. No child should ever be made to feel ashamed of their medical condition, Sophia said during the organization's launch. Having diabetes or any other medical condition is just part of life. It's not something to hide or be embarrassed about. Sophia's work helped thousands of children across the country feel more confident about managing their medical conditions in public and standing up to discrimination. While Sophia was thriving and using her experience to help others, Mrs. Morrison was discovering that life in prison was very different from the privileged existence she had enjoyed as HOA president. According to reports from the correctional facility, Mrs. Morrison had not adapted well to incarceration. She was used to being in control and having power over others, and the regimented life of prison was a difficult adjustment. She keeps trying to organize the other inmates and enforce rules, a prison guard told a journalist. She doesn't understand that she has no authority here and that the other inmates don't respect her. Mrs. Morrison's crime, attacking a disabled child, made her a target for other inmates who had children of their own and couldn't tolerate violence against kids. Most of the women here are mothers, explained another inmate. They don't have any patience for someone who would hurt a child, especially a disabled child who was just trying to manage her medical condition. Mrs. Morrison spent most of her time in protective custody, both for her own safety and because she couldn't get along with other inmates. She had also been required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment, but according to her psychiatrist, she continued to show little remorse for her actions. She still believes that Sophia was somehow at fault for the attack, the psychiatrist reported. In her mind, she was enforcing legitimate community standards rather than committing a violent crime against a child. As I write this, 10 years have passed since Mrs. Morrison stabbed my diabetic daughter with a fork for the crime of checking her blood sugar. Sophia is now 22 years old and has grown into a remarkable young woman who has turned her traumatic experience into a force for positive change. Sophia graduated from college with honors and is now in law school, studying disability rights law. Her goal is to become a civil rights attorney specializing in cases involving discrimination against disabled individuals. "I want to use the law to protect other children like me," Sophia explained during her graduation speech. "Mrs. Morrison tried to silence me and make me ashamed of my diabetes. Instead, she gave me a voice that I used to help others." Sophia's diabetes is well controlled, and she has never again let anyone make her feel ashamed about managing her medical condition. She checks her blood sugar wherever and whenever she needs to, and she encourages other diabetic children to do the same. "My diabetes is part of who I am, but it doesn't define me," Sophia often tells the children she mentors. "What defines me is how I choose to use my experiences to help others." Mrs. Morrison is still serving her 15-year sentence and will be eligible for parole in 5 more years. According to recent reports, she has shown no signs of rehabilitation or remorse, even after a decade in prison. "She still talks about Sophia like she was some kind of troublemaker," a prison counselor said. "She can't accept that she attacked an innocent child who was just trying to stay healthy." Sophia's Voice, the nonprofit organization that Sophia founded, has grown into a national movement that has helped thousands of families dealing with disability discrimination and violence. The foundation provides legal assistance, emotional support, and advocacy training to families whose children face harassment or bullying because of their medical conditions. "Sophia's courage in speaking out has given hope to so many other families," said Dr. Patricia Williams, a pediatrician who works with the foundation. "She's shown that survivors of disability-based violence can not only heal but can use their experiences to protect others." One case that particularly moved Sophia involved a family in Texas whose son with cerebral palsy was being harassed by their HOA board. Using the legal strategies that had worked in our case, Sophia's Voice was able to help that family obtain justice and see the HOA officials prosecuted for discrimination. "Thank you for showing us that we didn't have to accept this treatment," the boy's mother wrote to Sophia. "Because of your foundation, my son can now live without fear of harassment." These victories help Sophia know that her painful experience has led to meaningful change that protects other vulnerable children. Rosewood Hills has been completely transformed since Mrs. Morrison's removal and imprisonment. The new HOA board has focused on building an inclusive community rather than enforcing discriminatory rules. The community now hosts regular disability awareness events, has an active support group for families with special needs children, and has become known throughout the region as one of the most welcoming neighborhoods for disabled residents. "This is what Rosewood Hills was always meant to be," said current board president Jennifer Walsh. "A place where all families can live safely and feel supported, regardless of their medical conditions or disabilities." Sophia loves returning to the neighborhood where she was attacked, not because she wants to relive the trauma, but because she wants to see how far the community has come. "This is where Mrs. Morrison tried to silence me," Sophia said during a recent visit. "Now it's a place where disabled children are celebrated and supported. That's the best kind of justice." Sophia's case had far-reaching legal consequences that extended well beyond our family. The attack sparked new legislation designed to protect disabled individuals from harassment and violence in residential communities. The Sophia Torres Community Protection Act was passed in multiple states, creating stronger penalties for crimes motivated by disability bias and establishing oversight mechanisms for HOA boards. The law also required community leaders to undergo disability awareness training and prohibited them from engaging in discriminatory harassment of disabled residents. Sophia's case showed us how dangerous it can be when we give unchecked power to people who harbor prejudice against disabled individuals, said State Senator Michael Rodriguez, who sponsored the legislation. "This law helps ensure that what happened to Sophia can never happen to another child." I used my position as Deputy Commissioner to advocate for stronger hate crime laws and better training for law enforcement officers on disability rights issues. When someone attacks a child because of their disability, it's not just assault, it's terrorism designed to make disabled people afraid to exist in public, I explained during legislative hearings. We need laws that reflect the serious nature of these crimes. Today, Sophia is engaged to marry David, a wonderful young man she met in law school who also has type 1 diabetes. They plan to have children and are committed to raising them in a world where disability is accepted and accommodated rather than feared and attacked. David understands what it's like to live with diabetes, Sophia told us when she announced their engagement. But more importantly, he understands the importance of standing up for people who are different or vulnerable. Sophia's wedding will be held in the same community park where she used to check her blood sugar as a child, transforming a space associated with trauma into a place of celebration and hope. I want to get married in that park because it represents my journey, Sophia explained. It's where Mrs. Morrison tried to make me feel ashamed of my diabetes, but it's also where I learned that I was stronger than her hatred. Maria and I couldn't be more proud of the woman Sophia has become. The scared, hurt 12-year-old who was stabbed for managing her diabetes has grown into a confident advocate who uses her voice to protect other vulnerable children. Mrs. Morrison thought she could break our daughter's spirit, Maria said recently. Instead, she forged Sophia into someone who will spend her life making sure no other child suffers what she suffered. Mrs. Morrison became eligible for parole after serving 10 years of her 15-year sentence. However, her parole hearing did not go well, as she continued to show no remorse for attacking Sophia. I was trying to maintain community standards, Mrs. Morrison told the parole board. That child was violating health and safety rules by performing medical procedures in public areas. The parole board was shocked by her continued justification of the attack and her complete lack of understanding about diabetes or disability rights. Ms. Morrison, you stabbed a 12-year-old girl with a fork because she was checking her blood sugar, the board chairwoman said. Do you understand that this was a violent crime against an innocent child? I understand that I was protecting my community from disruptive behavior, Mrs. Morrison replied stubbornly. Her parole was denied, and she was ordered to serve the remainder of her sentence. The board noted that she posed a continued threat to disabled individuals and had shown no capacity for rehabilitation. Mrs. Morrison died in prison 2 years later from complications related to diabetes, the same medical condition that had driven her to attack Sophia. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew the case. She spent her final years living with the same condition she had terrorized my daughter for having, I observed. Perhaps if she had shown Sophia compassion instead of hatred, she might have learned something about managing diabetes with dignity. Sophia's law school graduation was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her advocacy work. Children with diabetes, families who had been helped by Sophia's voice, and legislators who had worked with her on disability rights legislation all came to celebrate her achievement. Sophia Torres represents the best of what America can be, said Congressman James Martinez during the graduation ceremony. She took a traumatic experience and transformed it into a force for justice and compassion. Sophia's first job out of law school was with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, where she works on cases involving disability discrimination and hate crimes. I get to use the law to protect people like me, Sophia said during her first week on the job. Every case I work on is a chance to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else. Sophia has also written a book about her experience titled, Stabbed for Being Different, A Diabetic Child's Fight for Justice. The book has become required reading in many disability studies programs and has helped educate thousands of people about the discrimination that disabled individuals face. Sophia's story is both heartbreaking and inspiring, wrote one reviewer. It shows the worst of human prejudice but also the best of human resilience and the power of turning pain into purpose. While Sophia's personal story has a positive ending, the fight against disability discrimination continues. Through Sophia's voice and her work with the Department of Justice, Sophia continues to encounter families facing harassment and violence because of medical conditions or disabilities. We've made progress but we still have a long way to go, Sophia said during a recent speech. There are still people out there who think that being different means being less valuable, and there are still children who are being bullied or attacked because of their medical conditions. Recent cases handled by Sophia's voice include a family whose autistic son was banned from a community pool, a girl with epilepsy who was excluded from school activities, and a boy with cerebral palsy whose family was harassed by their HOA board. Each case reminds me why this work is so important, Sophia explained. Every child deserves to live without fear, regardless of their medical condition or disability. Sophia's advocacy has also expanded internationally, as she works with organizations around the world to promote disability rights and combat discrimination. Disability discrimination is a global problem, Sophia said during a United Nations conference on disability rights. Children everywhere deserve protection from those who would harm them because they are different. As Sophia approaches her 25th birthday, she reflects on the journey that began with Mrs. Morrison's brutal attack in our backyard. If someone had told me when I was 12 that being stabbed with a fork would lead to a career helping other disabled children, I wouldn't have believed them, Sophia said recently. But sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the source of our greatest strength. Sophia's message to other children facing discrimination or violence because of their medical conditions is simple but powerful. You are not broken. You are not wrong. You are not less valuable because you have a medical condition or disability. The people who treat you badly are the ones with the problem, not you. She also has advice for parents of disabled children. Fight for your children. Don't let anyone make them feel ashamed of who they are or what they need to do to stay healthy. And remember that your child's differences might be exactly what the world needs. Last month, Sophia returned to Rosewood Hills to speak at the community's annual Disability Awareness event. She stood in the same backyard where Mrs. Morrison had stabbed her 13 years earlier, but now she was surrounded by supportive neighbors and families who celebrated diversity rather than fearing it. This place used to represent fear and hatred for me, Sophia told the audience. But now it represents hope and healing. It shows that communities can change, that people can grow, and that love is always stronger than hate. After her speech, a young girl with diabetes approached Sophia with her parents. "My name is Emma and I have diabetes too," the girl said shyly. "My mom told me about what happened to you. I was scared to check my blood sugar at school, but after hearing your story, I know it's okay." Sophia knelt down to Emma's level and smiled. "It's more than okay, it's important. Taking care of your diabetes is taking care of yourself, and you should never be ashamed of that." Watching Sophia mentor this young girl, I was reminded of how far our family has come since that terrible day when Mrs. Morrison's hatred nearly destroyed us. As I finish writing this account, I am filled with gratitude for the journey our family has traveled. What began as a story of hatred and violence has become a testament to the power of resilience, justice, and love. Mrs. Morrison thought she could terrorize my daughter into hiding her diabetes and disappearing from her community. Instead, she created a national advocate who has spent her life ensuring that no other child suffers the same discrimination and violence. The woman who stabbed Sophia with a fork because she couldn't stand the sight of a diabetic child managing her medical condition died alone in prison, forgotten by everyone except the corrections officers who managed her care. Sophia, meanwhile, continues to change the world one case, one speech, one child at a time. Every day when I watch Sophia check her blood sugar without shame or fear, when I see her advocating for other disabled children, when I witness her transforming pain into purpose, I am reminded that evil may be loud and violent, but goodness is stronger and more enduring. Mrs. Morrison's legacy is a prison cell and a gravestone. Sophia's legacy is a movement that has protected thousands of disabled children and will continue to protect future generations. The 12-year-old girl who was stabbed for having diabetes grew up to become a lawyer who uses the law to protect other vulnerable children. The community that once harbored a violent bigot has become a model of inclusion and acceptance. That is the true victory of justice over hatred. That is the real power of turning trauma into triumph. And that is why Sophia's story will continue to inspire and protect families for generations to come. Mrs. Morrison tried to silence my daughter with violence. Instead, she gave Sophia a voice that echoes around the world, calling for justice, equality, and hope for all children who are different. The woman who thought diabetes made Sophia unfit for her community was wrong about everything that mattered. Sophia's diabetes didn't make her less valuable. It made her the perfect person to fight for others who face discrimination because of their medical conditions. In the end, Mrs. Morrison's hatred created exactly the opposite of what she intended. Instead of eliminating Sophia from the community, she turned Sophia into a protector of vulnerable children everywhere. That is justice. That is redemption. That is the power of love to transform even the darkest evil into a force for good. Sophia Torres was stabbed with a fork for being diabetic. She survived to become a voice for every child who has ever been made to feel ashamed of who they are. And that voice will never be silenced.